For decades, when Canada needed a fighter jet, a radar system, or a submarine, there was really only one phone call to make: Washington. That was just how things worked. Canada bought American, trained alongside Americans, and built its entire defense posture around the assumption that the United States would always be there as the senior partner, the supplier, and the guarantor of last resort. That assumption is now breaking apart in real time, and it's breaking apart because of decisions Mark Carney is making right now, decisions that are quietly rewriting 6 decades of Canadian defense policy. This isn't a small policy tweak buried in a budget document. This is Canada looking at its biggest ally, its closest trading partner, and the country it has depended on for generations of military hardware, and deciding that dependence itself is the risk. Not China, not Russia, dependence on Washington. And once you understand why Carney reached that conclusion, the last 12 months of Canadian defense announcements start to look less like a series of disconnected decisions and a lot more like a single, deliberate strategy. Let's start with the moment that set all of this in motion.
This morning, NATO confirmed that Canada has achieved its 2% defense expenditure target, half a decade ahead of the original schedule.
Carney stood up and made a promise that no Canadian Prime Minister had managed to keep for decades. He committed Canada to finally hitting NATO's 2% of GDP defense spending target, and he didn't push it off into some distant future the way previous governments did. He moved the timeline up, aiming to hit it years ahead of what Ottawa had previously planned. For a country that had spent literally decades as NATO's most reliable underachiever on defense spending, this alone was a seismic shift. But the spending number was never really the headline. The headline was what Carney said while announcing it. He stood in front of cameras and essentially declared that the era of America's uncontested dominance on the world stage was over. Read that again. Canada's own Prime Minister, standing on Canadian soil, telling the world that the old order, the one where the United States set the terms and everyone else followed, was finished. That is not the kind of sentence a Prime Minister says by accident. And it's definitely not the kind of sentence you say if your plan is to keep buying everything from the same supplier you've always bought from. So what did Canada actually do next? This is where it gets interesting because the moves weren't symbolic. They were concrete, expensive, and aimed directly at the heart of Canada's military relationship with Washington. Take the radar deal.
The agreement that Stephen and I have just signed represents the biggest defence export in Australia's history, with Canada's procurement of the over-the-horizon radar.
For years, when Canada thought about early warning and surveillance systems, the default assumption was that any major purchase would eventually land on an American contractor's desk. Instead, Canada signed a massive deal for an over-the-horizon radar system, and the company that won it wasn't based in Texas or Virginia. It was based in Australia. This was Australia's biggest defense export in its history, and it caught Washington completely off guard. Think about what that means. The United States didn't even see this coming. Canada, a country Washington has treated for years as a junior partner who would simply fall in line, went out and signed one of the largest defense contracts in recent memory with someone other than the United States, and didn't feel the need to ask permission first. And the radar deal wasn't a one-off. It's part of a pattern, and once you start looking for it, you can't stop seeing it. Canada has been eyeing new submarines for years, a program that's been delayed and debated for what feels like forever. The expectation, the old expectation, was that eventually this would funnel toward American shipbuilders or American-aligned suppliers. Instead, Ottawa is now seriously weighing bids from South Korea and a joint German-Norwegian partnership.
I'll be back in 60 days.
Canada plans to buy up to a dozen submarines in the next 15 years, an investment worth tens of billions of dollars. There are 2 bids, and this Canadian Rear Admiral would be happy with either.
2 completely different options, neither of them American, both of them representing a real, tangible shift in where Canada is choosing to spend its defense dollars, and more importantly, where it's choosing to build long-term industrial relationships. Then there's the one that probably stings the most in Washington. Canada had agreed, under previous governments, to purchase 88 F-35 fighter jets from the United States. That deal isn't dead, but it's not safe either. Canada's Department of National Defense is actively looking at European alternatives, weighing whether locking the country into another generation of dependence on American fighter technology actually serves Canada's interests anymore, or whether it makes more sense to diversify toward European manufacturers who don't come with the same political baggage attached. When a country starts reconsidering a deal that's already been signed, that tells you something. It tells you the strategic calculus has genuinely changed, not just at the margins, but at the core. Now, why would Canada do any of this? Why would you deliberately complicate your own defense procurement, take on new costs, new training requirements, new logistics challenges, just to avoid buying from the supplier that's literally next door and that you've worked with for generations? The answer Carney himself has given is blunt. and it's worth hearing in his own framing. He's talked about a hinge moment in Canadian history, a period where the old assumptions about who Canada could rely on simply don't hold anymore. He's pointed to an unraveling of the rules-based international order that Canada built its entire post-war foreign policy around, and he's been explicit that an increasingly unreliable United States is part of that calculation, not as an enemy, not as a hostile power, but as a partner whose direction has become genuinely unpredictable. Think about the trade war that's been simmering between the two countries. Tariff threats on Canadian goods, aircraft tariffs, steel and aluminum disputes that flare up and die down depending on the political mood in Washington that particular week. An American president who's openly mused about whether Canada even deserves the trade relationship it has, while at the same time complaining that Canada doesn't contribute enough to its own defense. You cannot build a military procurement strategy around a partner who is simultaneously your largest trading relationship and the source of constant economic uncertainty. At some point, any government, regardless of who's in charge, has to ask whether putting all of your defense eggs in one increasingly unpredictable basket is actually a smart long-term play. Carney has clearly decided it isn't, but here's where the story gets more complicated, and where Carney's strategy actually reveals something more sophisticated than just walking away from Washington. Canada isn't pulling back from NATO, it's doing the opposite. Carney has been on the phone directly with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, coordinating ahead of the upcoming summit, talking through everything from Ukraine support to Arctic defense capabilities to the alliance's broader posture in an increasingly unstable world. Canada has deployed its largest sustained military presence in Europe in more than 3 decades through Operation Reassurance, putting Canadian boots on the ground in Latvia as part of NATO's Eastern Flank Deterrence mission. This is not a country retreating into isolation. This is a country deliberately diversifying its alliances while doubling down on the parts of the international system it still believes in. And that distinction matters enormously, because it changes the entire narrative. This isn't Canada turning its back on collective defense. It's Canada refusing to let one increasingly erratic partner be the only option on the table. Carney has talked about working more closely with the Nordic countries, with the United Kingdom, with France, with Germany, specifically on Arctic security, recognizing that protecting Canada's north and protecting the Baltic region are two ends of the same strategic problem. If you want to secure the Arctic, you need partners who actually care about northern security as much as you do, and increasingly, those partners are in Europe, not necessarily in Washington. There's also a piece of this that doesn't get talked about enough, and it's the industrial side. When Canada buys a radar system from Australia instead of the United States, that's not just a procurement decision. It's a statement about where Canada wants its long-term defense industrial relationships to live. Every major defense contract comes with decades of maintenance contracts, technology sharing, training partnerships, and supply chain integration. By spreading those relationships across Australia, potentially South Korea, potentially Germany and Norway, and exploring European fighter alternatives, Canada isn't just diversifying its arsenal. It's diversifying its entire defense ecosystem, building redundancy into a system that for far too long had a single point of failure sitting just south of the border. Now, you might be thinking, this all sounds great in theory, but is Canada actually capable of pulling this off? And that's a fair question because there are real obstacles here. Canada's domestic defense production has never operated at the scale this kind of diversification requires. The country's existing military equipment and broader defense infrastructure have been closely integrated with American systems for generations, which means untangling that integration isn't as simple as signing a few new contracts. There are real questions about whether the Department of National Defense can actually spend the new money being committed at the pace required, whether training pipelines can keep up with new equipment from new suppliers, whether the logistics of operating multiple different systems from multiple different countries creates more complexity than it solves. These aren't hypothetical concerns. Defense analysts in Canada have been raising them directly, pointing out that announcing billions in new spending is one thing, but actually executing complex multi-year procurement and integration plans is something else entirely. Carney's government is essentially betting that the strategic upside of diversification outweighs the very real near-term friction of moving away from systems and suppliers Canada has worked with for half a century. And then there's Washington's reaction, which has been more measured than you might expect, at least publicly. The American ambassador to Canada has gone on record framing the new spending commitments as good for the alliance, good for shared security, the kind of statement you'd expect when one ally finally agrees to pay more into the collective pot. But that framing conveniently sidesteps the more uncomfortable reality underneath it, which is that a meaningful chunk of that new spending isn't going toward American companies at all. It's heading to Australia, potentially to South Korea, potentially to a German-Norwegian partnership, and potentially toward European fighter jet manufacturers instead of American ones. Washington can welcome the headline number while quietly recognizing that the era of Canada being a default customer for American defense exports is fading. So where does this actually leave things? Carney has made it clear that none of this is about hostility toward the United States. He's continued direct, substantive conversations with the American president on NATO priorities, on the situation in the Middle East, on the broader security relationship between the two countries. These aren't the actions of a government trying to pick a fight. They're the actions of a government trying to build optionality, trying to make sure that whatever direction American politics takes in the years ahead, Canada isn't left exposed because it put all of its strategic eggs in one increasingly unpredictable basket. What makes this moment genuinely historic is the scale of the reversal. For the better part of a century, Canadian defense policy operated on a simple premise. The United States is reliable, the United States is predictable, and Canada's job is to stay close enough to benefit from that reliability without having to build the kind of independent capability that would actually cost real money. Carney has effectively thrown that premise out. He's betting that the next decade looks nothing like the last 6, that a world of shifting alliances and great power rivalry requires Canada to actually be capable of standing on its own 2 feet, with partners it chooses deliberately rather than partners it simply inherited from history. Whether this strategy succeeds is genuinely an open question. Diversification is expensive, it's slow, it requires building institutional capacity that doesn't currently exist at the scale needed. And there's always a risk that spreading commitments across multiple new partners means none of those relationships gets the depth and reliability that comes from decades of integration with a single dominant supplier. But the alternative, staying locked into a defense relationship with a partner whose policy direction can shift dramatically from one administration to the next, carries its own risks. Risks that Carney has clearly decided are no longer acceptable for a country that wants genuine control over its own security future. What's certain is that the Canada of 5 years from now is going to look meaningfully different from the Canada of today when it comes to defense. Different suppliers, different alliances, different assumptions about who Canada can count on and under what circumstances. Carney didn't just announce a spending increase. He set in motion a fundamental rewiring of how Canada thinks about its own security, and the ripple effects of that decision are going to be felt for decades, regardless of what happens in the next election or the one after that. There's one more layer to this that deserves attention, because it explains why Carney's approach is fundamentally different from previous attempts by Canadian governments to talk tough on sovereignty without actually changing anything. Past governments loved to talk about Canadian independence and Canadian values, while quietly continuing to do business exactly the way it had always been done. Carney's version comes with receipts, contracts signed, money committed, suppliers chosen. This is the difference between rhetoric and policy, and it's why allies and adversaries alike are paying closer attention to Ottawa than they have in decades. Consider the broader picture Carney has been painting on the world stage. He's talked openly about the need for middle powers, countries like Canada that don't have the raw size or military weight of a true superpower, to combine forces rather than negotiate individually from positions of weakness. His argument is straightforward. When a country like Canada sits down one-on-one with a hegemon, it negotiates from a position where it has very little leverage. It either accepts what's offered or walks away with nothing. But when middle powers act together, when they pool resources, diversify suppliers, and build genuine alternatives, the dynamic shifts entirely. Suddenly, Washington isn't the only option on the table, and that changes every conversation that follows. This is also why the Arctic keeps coming up in Carney's public statements. It's not just about ice and territory. The Arctic sits at the intersection of everything this defense strategy is trying to achieve. Protecting Canadian sovereignty in the north requires partners who actually understand northern security, and increasingly that means deeper cooperation with Nordic countries who have spent generations dealing with exactly these kinds of challenges. It means working with the United Kingdom and France on a security architecture that doesn't automatically funnel through Washington. And it means building Canadian capability, real radar systems, real submarines, real surveillance infrastructure that doesn't disappear the moment a different administration in Washington decides Arctic security isn't a priority anymore. There's also a domestic political dimension that shouldn't be ignored. Defense spending of this magnitude, billions of dollars flowing into new programs, new contracts, and new partnerships, doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens against a backdrop of debates over government spending, over where Canada's economic priorities should sit, and over whether this kind of strategic pivot is something Canadians are actually willing to pay for. So far, the political response has been surprisingly unified. Even opposition parties that disagree with Carney on almost everything else have signaled support for hitting NATO's spending targets, recognizing that the strategic argument for diversification has broad appeal across the political spectrum. That kind of consensus is rare in Canadian politics, and it tells you something about how seriously this moment is being taken across party lines. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Is this the moment Canada finally grows into a more independent, more confident middle power on the world stage? The kind of country that makes its own strategic decisions instead of inheriting them from Washington? Or does spreading defense commitments across half a dozen new partners end up creating more vulnerability than it solves, leaving Canada more exposed precisely because it tried to avoid being exposed in the first place? Let us know what you think in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of decision history is going to judge very differently, depending on how the next few years unfold. If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is far from finished. There are more procurement decisions coming, more NATO summits ahead, and almost certainly more reaction from Washington as this strategy keeps unfolding. Like this video if you want more deep dives like this one, share it with anyone who's been following the Canada-US relationship, and drop your take in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.